What does an Old Testament believer look like? What is the testimony of an Old Testament person that makes them a New Testament believer? Today, we're going to talk about a Gentile king who makes a proclamation that really thrusts him into the category of an Old Testament saint. And we're going to talk about that today in the book of Daniel, the 4th chapter. And we'll do that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. This is a real Bible study between friends. There's no rehearsal. There's no script. This is just two friends getting together, and we're inviting you to sit in and join us. You can join the discussion by using your comments, and be sure to hit the like button if you like this video. That helps us with the YouTube algorithm, and we'd appreciate that. And subscribe by all means. I'd love to hear your comments as we go along here. Kyle Grinstead and I are going to continue in the book of Daniel. This is my favorite chapter in the whole book, and I'll explain why in a minute. We're going to talk about the impact God had in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. There's a time gap between the end of chapter 3, where we see Nebuchadnezzar kind of starting to come around. He makes the comment that your God is the Most High, and there's no other God that could do what I just saw in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then all of a sudden we have chapter 4. This is not chronological. There's approximately 30 years that goes between the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar reigns for 43 years. And we know from this chapter that we're about to look at that 7 years of that reign, he was insane. Then he gets his sanity back, and he is reinstated as the king, and he reigns then for a few more years. Now we see in chapter 5 that his son is the king in chapter 5. So chapter 4 is there somewhere in the middle, and most of the scholars believe that it's about 30 years after the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's towards the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and Belshazzar, his son, is about to take over. And if you remember in chapter 2 and 3, Nebuchadnezzar was fairly new as a king in Babylon.
Right.
And so now we're towards the end of his reign. So they think that 30 years and then the 7 years of insanity and then a few more years of reign before he dies. That makes sense?
Got it. Yeah, it does.
Just to give a chronological feel to what's happening here. And if you remember, when Daniel came to Babylon as a captive, he was a teenager. So there's a few years before Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's episode, and then we have about 30 years. So most of the scholars think that Daniel is somewhere around 50 years old at this point. Okay, just a little thing to consider as we go here. We're going to see some interesting things. Let's get into the scriptures together. Now, read verse 1, 2, and 3.
Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth. May your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation.
Okay, now, this is an official proclamation that he would have written down and had distributed in his kingdom, because he says, this is a message for all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth that I rule, right? May your peace abound. And this is the idea of may you be prosperous, may you be blessed. And then he goes into this, it seemed good to me to write this. And I believe that this is a proclamation of an Old Testament believer. If we read verses 2 and 3, he calls him the Most High God. And then he goes into this, how great are his signs and how mighty are his works. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. Now, this is the king of Babylon speaking, and yet he is acknowledging that God's kingdom is everlasting and God's dominion is from generation to generation. Okay? So I really start to feel that what we have here is an Old Testament proclamation. If this was somebody like Jeremiah or Isaiah that wrote, God is the Most High God and he has blessed me and his dominion is forever from generation to generation and his kingdom is forever, we would say, wow, that is a great statement of faith, wouldn't we? Now, I want us to compare, and I want you to read in the same chapter, verses 34 to 37. This is the completion of Nebuchadnezzar's testimony.
But at the end of those days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven, and my sanity was restored to me. Then I praised the Most High, and I honored and glorified him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does as he pleases with the army of heaven and the peoples of the earth. There is no one who can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done?
This is spoken by the most powerful king on earth at the time.
Yeah.
The king of Babylon.
Who just previously set up here's this shrine to worship my kingdom.
Yeah, exactly. Right? In 30 years earlier in chapter 3. And God begins to work on him. And what we have in chapter 4 that I love so much is we have a testimony of faith by an Old Testament believer. If we had this from any other writer in the Old Testament, other than some people say, oh, he's the king of Babylon, God can't convert him. But yes, he can. And what we see in this is Nebuchadnezzar is going to write to us in the rest of the chapter a recap of how he became a believer in the Most High God. And even though he's king, he admits God is the God above every God. His kingdom is forever. He does whatever he wants. I summed it up in my notes saying, Nebuchadnezzar admits God is God and I'm not.
Yeah.
This is a wonderful proclamation of what an Old Testament Gentile believer looks like and what his testimony is. So we see this as a wonderful message of faith that an Old Testament believer who does not have the full gospel of Jesus Christ yet, but even in this statement that he makes, there's an illusion of Jesus. He alludes to Jesus coming. In what way do you see that? When he makes the statement of the Most High God.
The Most High, you're talking about at the beginning or here at the end?
Either one. He makes it twice. But he alludes to Christ as Messiah when he says God's kingdom is eternal. God's kingdom is forever. We know now as New Testament, who's the king?
Jesus.
Jesus is the king. So this is a Old Testament viewpoint of the Most High God who is going to reign. And the fact that he's going to reign through his son, Jesus Christ, is a New Testament concept that he hasn't got yet. The information that he has about God, he is making a proclamation. I believe this and I surrender to it, right?
Yeah. I think it's just cool how you call it a testimony. And oftentimes a part of a testimony is you see, here's what I was like before, here's where I came from, here's the sin I was involved in. And I think we see that in chapters 1 through 3 on display. And then we get to 4 and you see.
He's even going to admit that as we read through the story, and we're going to read it very quickly. But as we read through his testimony, we're going to see how God works and how he writes how God works. This is a quote. Most of chapter 4 is a quote from Nebuchadnezzar about what happened to him. It's literally his testimony about how God worked to bring him to the point of being a believer. And we're going to see that as we go here, that this is not a secret, between the lines testimony. This is a written proclamation that he distributes through his whole kingdom. Amazing. This is a public testimony to everybody in his kingdom. God is the Most High, the King who can do anything he wishes can do in a life. And we'll keep that in mind as we go here, because it's really cool. All right. Now, we're going to start to read the narrative. Now, he starts out in the fourth verse, I, Nebuchadnezzar. So this is Nebuchadnezzar speaking. This is part of his proclamation. And he says, I was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. And I put a note there. He says, I was taking it easy in my house and I was doing really great. Then God came calling. Okay. He's going to say that. He's going to say that in the next verse. If you and I were talking about how we became believers, we would do something very similar. There was a point in my life where I was just going along, minding my own business, and then God started to work in my life. So read from 5 down to verse 7, and I want to make a point here afterwards, but go ahead and read down that story. This is Nebuchadnezzar speaking.
Okay. A dream, and it made me fearful. And these fantasies, as I lay on my bed, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. So I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners came in, and I related the dream to them, but they could not make its interpretation known to me.
Okay, now, what we have here is, this is his second dream that has scared him, right?
Yeah.
The first one we see over in chapter 2, and he calls the same people, the conjurers and all these stuff, except now the head Chaldean is Daniel. And I want us to see something in verse 8. This time it's different than the first time in that this time he tells them the dream and asks them to say what it means, and they still can't. And then he says, but finally Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belteshazzar. Now, it's significant. I want to make a significant point. Nebuchadnezzar had named Daniel Belshazzar. We saw that in chapter 1.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting that as part of his testimony, what does he call Daniel?
Calls him Daniel.
Daniel. And he says, now Daniel is Belshazzar in the language of my gods, which is the Babylonian culture. So he's going to use the name Belshazzar for most of the story about Daniel, but twice he uses the term Daniel and calls Daniel by his Jewish name, by his believing name, you would say. So I think it's significant that even though Nebuchadnezzar is telling the story of Belshazzar in the kingdom, he uses Daniel's real name. And then he goes, now this is Daniel, who is Belshazzar for all you Babylonians. I think that's neat. Now let's go back.
And there's those little things you read right past that and miss it, but I appreciate the clarity on that.
Yeah, and that's this idea that I've talked about so often of let's read slowly. You know what I'm saying? Don't hurry through this. Think about what is being actually said. Now, let's start. Read from verse 8, and let's go down through the dream. Go ahead and just start reading. I'll stop us when we can. This is basically just a narrative, so we'll just go through it very quickly.
But finally Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And I related the dream to him, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that a spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream which I've seen, along with its interpretation. Now these were the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed. I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height great. The tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached to the sky, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all.
Go ahead, keep reading.
The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches, and all living creatures fed themselves from it. I was looking in the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. He shouted out and spoke as follows: Chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from it, and the birds from its branches. Leave the stump with its root in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it, and the new grass of the field. And let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beasts and the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is at the command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whom he wishes, and sets over it the lowliest of men.
Okay. Now, let's stop there and talk about this a little bit. This narrative that Nebuchadnezzar is sharing, what do you see?
One thing that kind of stood out is at the beginning when he's talking about Daniel, he says, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. I thought that was
Yeah.
kind of interesting.
Which is basically what he said the first time that Daniel interpreted a dream. Now they've had
Yeah.
30 years where Daniel has served him as the head of the magician, and he basically starts from that position. Now, what we have is he has a dream. And one of the things we know from today is God is working in the lives of Muslims and Hindus through dreams. And I've heard many testimonies from Muslims who are becoming Christians because they're experiencing dreams that bring them to a point of acknowledging Christ as God and as Messiah. We see that exact thing happening in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. And
Yeah.
this is a valid point. Now, we today, because we have the whole Bible, we need to be careful that when we have a dream, that it is a dream that aligns with sound doctrine. And we can see that in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, in that it basically brings him to the conclusion that God is the most high and he can do whatever he wants on the earth. That's good doctrine.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we see that. Now, I'm going to continue on very quickly here. Let me read verse 18 and I'll go into the rest of verse 18 here. It says, this is the dream when I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belshazzar, tell me its interpretation, inasmuch as none of the wise men of my kingdom is able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, because a spirit of the holy gods is in you. Then Daniel, whose name is Belshazzar, was appalled for a while as his thoughts alarmed him. The king responded and said, Belshazzar, do not let the dream of it or its interpretation alarm you. Belshazzar replied, oh, my lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you and its interpretation to your adversaries. So basically, what he's saying here, these guys have known each other now for 30 years. Don't be alarmed about interpreting this if it's bad news. Just give it to me. And he says, oh, king, I wish this dream was about somebody who was an enemy, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's about you. And this shows a bit of a relationship between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. By the time he served for 30 years as the head of the magicians, there's been a relationship here. And he says, I wish this dream was not the news that it was. I wish this was about an enemy, but it's not. And he goes back into this. Any other comments? You with me?
Yeah, I'm with you.
As we go here, and he goes on, starting in verse 20. He says, the tree that you saw, which became large and grew strong, whose height reached to the skies, was visible all over the earth, and whose foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and whose branches and birds of the sky lodged. It is you, O king, for you have become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached to the sky. and your dominion to the ends of the earth, in that the king saw an angelic watcher, a holy one. That is basically an Old Testament term for an angel. This would be an Old Testament Gentiles term for an angel, is this angelic messenger watcher, a holy one
Okay.
descended from heaven, saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, yet leave a stump with its roots in the ground, with a band of iron and bronze around it, in the new grass of the field, and let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beasts of the field until 7 periods. Now, this is a reiteration of what you read was his dream. Now, it's very
Yeah.
interesting. The tree that is Nebuchadnezzar is going to be chopped down, but there's going to be a remnant left of the tree, the stump. And there's a
Yeah.
period of time, the significance of the band around the stump is talking about there is a period of time where the king is cut down to size, but he's also bound, right? Which is a great
Yeah.
description of the 7 years of insanity that's about to
Okay.
come. He's not killed, his kingdom is taken away from him, and he is for a period of time bound in the new grass. And we're going to see he's going to start to eat that grass pretty soon here. So we go into this testimony. You with me so far?
Yeah.
Let's go back. In verse 24, and this is the interpretation, O king. This is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you are driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be the beasts of the field, and you will be given grass to eat like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time. Now, in the Hebrew, that periods of time could also be interpreted years. That's why most of the scholars think
Okay.
this is for a 7 years period. If you look over at that little number over to verse 25, it's basically of years, right? And it goes, this period of
Okay.
time until you recognize that the Most High ruler is over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whoever he wishes. Now, rather than hurry through this, let's talk about this a little bit, but let's stop here and just talk about this interpretation of the dream. And I want to talk historically. There is a disease that does happen to people that they begin to believe that they're basically a ruminant animal. And this disease is called bovinism or something like that. And it's an actual disease that falls on them. And as we see, God takes away his kingdom, but also takes away his sanity, where he starts to eat that grass that the prophecy talks about, and he starts to dwell with wild animals. In fact, over in chapter 5, verse 20, it talks about he lives with donkeys out in the field and
Yeah.
for 7 years, and his hair grows long and his fingernails grow long because nobody is tending him. He's out of his mind. And we see that even today as a modern mental breakdown. It
Okay.
happens to him. He says in his testimony that we're going to continue next week. I think, because I want to dwell on this a little bit, is it is so significant when you compare the testimony of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4 with the testimony that we would have when we're sharing how we became a Christian, how we accepted Christ into our life, and the working that God brought us to, and the similarities. And this is the testimony of a believer. I am absolutely convinced of that. Some scholars say no, that he's just this rotten old king. But it is so clear from this, Kyle, that I really think that twice in the beginning and the end, he makes this public declaration that God is the Most High. He is king, and his dominion, he can do whatever he wants to do, including with Nebuchadnezzar himself.
Yeah. It's interesting picking up what you said there about this public declaration, but there's, like currently the New Testament church has the ordinance of baptism where you publicly proclaim your faith.
Exactly. Exactly.
And you almost see this model almost where he becomes a believer and then he makes this kind of very public, because he's the king, but very public proclamation. I think it's
It
an
is
interesting parallel.
it's a public proclamation of what is going on in Nebuchadnezzar's heart. And baptism is a public proclamation of what has happened in your heart. And the king here, we know from the book of Esther that the kings of Babylon and Persia were used to writing stuff down in their book. They held a book of all the things of a kingdom. And this is a public legal proclamation that the king is making to everybody, that basically says, this is what God has done in my life to bring me to a point where I admit he is the most high God. He is above all other gods. His kingdom is forever, and he can do whatever he wants on the earth. That is
Yeah,
a substantial proclamation. And
it
I
is.
think we're going to continue that next week. And we're going to see this real statement of faith that we shouldn't gloss over. We shouldn't just say, oh, this is another dream, and Nebuchadnezzar has it, Daniel interprets it, and we go on. And then next chapter is talking about Nebuchadnezzar's son. We're going to see that for a period of time, for a few years, Nebuchadnezzar reigned as a believing king. He reigned after he gets his right mind back, and he says, God restored me. It's part of his testimony. And he reigns, his kingdom is given back to him. And he reigns as a king who believes God is above everybody, and God does on the earth whatever he pleases. That's an amazing statement,
Yeah, it is.
an amazing testimony. And we'll continue that next week. All right.
All right.
Today we've been talking about the testimony of an Old Testament believer. I want to recommend a video to you. It's called "The Bible Equips My Testimony." It's out of Psalm 119. I think you'll enjoy it. Listen, we're going to continue in our study in the book of Daniel. And until then, God bless you.